To start this session, I wanted to show a video. I hope we have it ready to go. So let's talk money. All right, I am going to ask the first question to Shane because Good Return was the organization that helped develop this campaign. Does it work?
Thanks, Kelly. I think we've certainly been on a journey at Good Return over the last 10 years in terms of our financial education and financial capability work. Like others in the sector, I think the emergence of reports over recent years looking into randomised control trials around what works and what doesn't has forced us to confront the reality that in many cases financial education programs are not translating into financial behaviour change. Let's first accept, however, that financial literacy is important, and the 2013 over-indebtedness study here in Cambodia actually proved that. One of the key findings of that study was that financial literacy had a very close correlation. It was significantly related to people's ability to manage their money, and so over-indebtedness and people who are suffering from over-indebtedness was inversely related to financial literacy. So we know that it's important, but how does somebody become financially literate? And that's really one of the challenges. And is financial literacy enough? How do we move beyond that to capability and behaviour? And so we did a cross-country study of our programs. We've been working with MFIs to help them develop internal financial education programs for many years. And our programs would be familiar to many of you. We talked about things like saving, managing loans, managing household budgets, practice calculating interest rates, the things that most financial education and financial literacy programs would cover. We were always comforted by the fact that pre- and post-tests demonstrated that people had significantly increased their knowledge and skills. However, when we went back a couple of years ago and did a multi-country study, what we found was there was reasonable retention of knowledge and reasonable retention of skills. Attitudes, that was a little bit more difficult, and behaviours virtually non-existent. We really struggled to find examples. Only 1 out of 3 countries we could find examples where there was sustained behaviour change, and that was in a much more educated environment in the Philippines than we deal with here in Cambodia or in Nepal or other programs. So we fundamentally went back and reviewed and revised our whole approach to financial capability building. We still do training programs, but those training programs have a much stronger behavioural focus. And so people every week are tasked with going back. They have a weekly take-home challenge. They've got a money tracker. They've got to track their money in and money out. And it's really about observing your own reactions to money. What are the unconscious reactions that you have? What are the norms that you fall into? For example, for me, it might be buying a cup of coffee on my way to work. I might spend $3. Over the course of the year, that's $1,000. If I value coffee that much and I choose to invest $1,000 in a year in it, that's fine. But in a local context here, it might be somebody who's going to market. On their way home from market, they're buying some sweets. A very similar situation. And so the first thing we do is recognising unproductive money habits and helping people to change those. Then we talk about engaging with your financial service provider. So we track the degree to which they're shopping around rather than just responding to offers for products, comparing products and services, asking questions of your financial service provider. And before you ditch one provider and go to another, give feedback to your provider. How often do you actually give feedback to your financial service provider? And so our discussions that we have with clients these days are much more around what are you doing in these areas? What have you done this week or this month to address your needs? So we've fundamentally revised that approach and we're rolling that out in our programs now. And increasingly, and Jayshree will talk about this shortly, but we're looking at embedding our programs into the delivery channels of financial products themselves. An example in the Solomon Islands is that we are working on a digital savings wallet together with the central bank and one of the banks that embeds financial education within the delivery channel of the savings wallet.
Thank you, Shane. Jayshree, would you like to share your experience?
I'd actually like to start with commenting on what you said early on, which is that financial literacy does not work and it needs to be thrown out of the window. So we did a study at the Center for Financial Inclusion, and which basically mapped innovations in financial capability, and we had examples from across the world. And we did a literature survey. And what literature indicates is that results from financial literacy and financial education campaigns are at best mixed. I think it would be incorrect to throw it all out of the window. What we need to...
Interjection? That was the researcher. I funded a lot of projects, so I definitely, yeah.
Yeah, of course. But what we outlined in the report is, what are the principles that we need to think about while delivering financial education in an effective manner? And so some of these are, obviously it has to lead to change in behavior, as Shane pointed out. So you embed it in the delivery. But you also take it closer to the delivery point. So the best people to know effective methods are the financial service providers themselves. And all of this needs to be customer-led. So, while we can provide a lot of information, and financial education tends to be mostly information-led, we also need to understand what are the barriers to uptake and usage. And it could be as simple as fear to get into a bank branch, or just the lack of confidence in using a particular service. And so, there are about 7 principles for financial capability, and I'm happy to talk about those and examples of the same.
Okay, thank you. I am particularly interested in how does the delivery and effectiveness of financial education differ by gender? Jacqueline, if you could speak to that.
Sure, and I also was wondering if it's okay if I add some evidence on your question, because I think what my co-panelists have mentioned about embedding the education in the delivery of a product is incredibly important, and we've actually seen some success both from independent impact evaluations as well as monitoring. And so we did a program, for example, in India, where the bank officers were the ones delivering frequent, short messages of financial education, and we saw that those that participated in that program were likely to increase their savings threefold. So 3 times as many people increased their savings from having participated in this very high touch, but very much part of the product delivery mechanism of financial education. And later we can also talk about some broader mass communications campaigns that have also had some really interesting evidence of positive impact. But to your question about gender differences, we definitely see that we need to take gender into consideration in really all aspects of financial service provision. So from education, marketing, really to product design and delivery channels. And this is for a few reasons. At the very core, women are less likely to be literate and financially literate. In Cambodia, for example, we see at least a 10-point difference, a 10 percentage point difference between genders, and that depends on the survey. It can be quite a bigger difference. But it's really not just about literacy or financial literacy. It's also about what Jayshree alluded to, which is confidence and comfort in using financial services. And so women in particular, we need to find ways to work with them to ensure that we build that confidence alongside the knowledge. The other aspect of women that I wanted to mention is the fact that women are time poor. And we know that everyone has busy lives, but what we see is that women have this dual role as the caregivers, the household managers, as well as business owners or employees. And so really building financial education in a way that's efficient and time sensitive for women is really important. And the final aspect that I'll mention is really about how you communicate with women. We see that women really need time to digest information, to absorb the information they're getting, and to make financial decisions. And they're also more likely to accept that information if it comes from someone they trust. So if you're a financial institution that's thinking about delivering financial education, when you think about gender differences, it might be the channels you use. So below the line marketing, using community leaders or people that women trust to deliver this information, we've seen enormous success in women retaining that information and then applying it in their behavior of how they use those products.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Look, I'm particularly interested from the practitioner perspective. the argument is that, okay, financial literacy is good for clients, but if you have a financially literate client, they may choose not to use some of your products. They may choose not to take a loan. They may choose rather to have savings. So from a financial provider perspective, how can it be good for both the client and for your financial institution to have a financially literate client?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that the financial literacy is very key important for the microfinance, for the customer as well, because we want to grow together, we want to success together. If the customer well understand about financial literacy, for example, like they understand well about savings, they understand well about how to manage debt, they understand how to run the business, they understand about the cash management or the loan products, saving products, or any other product of the microfinance, so they can select, they can use it properly. When the customer use it properly, that can be positive impacts to the microfinance as well. So if the customer is success, and the microfinance will be success as well. That is the key important. And the one more thing as well, based on our the conference or the workshop on Monday, early this week as well, when we say something, what is the problematic cause in terms of over-indebtedness? So in the group discussion, the big group discussion, they always raise. The first one is financial literacy. The second one is in terms of high growth, or the third one is in terms of the lack of internal capacity. So everyone in the workshop define that the financial literacy is the key important point, and to educate the customers. And one more thing, so financial literacy is a long-term or medium-term strategies. So we cannot just say, oh, I provide the financial literacy 1 year already, but not success. So the customer is still over-indebtedness, the customer still big multiple loan. I say 1 year or 2 years, that is not enough. So we should take 3 years, 10 years, something like just only the routine works. Yeah. And for example, I just only see in terms of the some projects that has happened in Cambodia that very successful by the NGO. For example, it's some kind of the HIV programs, some kind of the, we can say cigarette, the program as well. So from 1993, so the NGO, all the stakeholders just work very closely on that, just only to educate, disseminate all the information to the people, especially in the rural area from day to day. But later on, as of now, we have very successful in terms of the program. It means that right now the percentage of the people have HIV in Cambodia, very small percentage, especially related to the cigarette, that the people smoke cigarette in Cambodia, I think less than 1 or 2%, something like that. But we need to take time to educate the people against and against. I think this is very key important things.
Thank you. That's a really good point. It's not a one-time effort. It's a long-term effort over a period of time. I think this also goes to, kind of leads into my next question, and whose responsibility is it to provide financial education? And I think Vok just touched on who suffers in the absence of having a financially literate population. But whose responsibility is it? Jayshree, do you have some thoughts on that?
So it's definitely the financial service provider's responsibility. It's also the government's responsibility or the regulator's responsibility. And to what Vern said about repeating the message over and over again, it can be made far more effective if one can identify the specific moments when the message is most relevant. So teachable moments, for instance. And identifying that is best done by the service provider because they're closest to the customer, and that kind of information can't really come from a regulator. But then there are, it's also important, so while we speak of these two important stakeholders in financial capability, it's also important to make sure that there's participation by a larger, broader group. And by that I mean filmmakers or people who are thinking about HCD, for instance. And there are lots of instances where, an example that comes to mind is Makutano Junction, where WWB participated with 3 banks in Kenya, and they made a short film that spoke of the importance of formal savings. And they tracked this over 4 months and found that the number of savings account had gone up by about 140,000. And the playback was much longer, even beyond that. In South Africa, the NDMA commissioned filmmakers to make to weave in the message of responsible credit into a popular soap opera called Scandal. And again, the playback was very, very high. So, the universe of stakeholders has to expand way beyond people who are directly involved in financial education as well.
If I can just add to that, I think also it helps to look at who's affected if things go wrong. If we look at Andhra Pradesh in India or any of the countries that have suffered crises in the sector, everybody suffers, and that pushes the responsibility back on everybody to make sure that things work. And so, it's a range of it's the government, it's providers, it's even clients themselves are responsible for their own capability. They need to take initiative for that, and other sector providers. It was really encouraging yesterday to hear the Deputy Governor of NBC talking about NBC's efforts to work with the Ministry of Education for a much stronger focus on financial education in schools. That was fantastic to hear. And in addition to, of course, policies and roadmaps are very important for governments, but action is the real thing that we're looking for. And I'd like to compliment NBC. Their entry into the financial consumer awareness space was not to commission a 3-year study and develop long-term strategies. They just jumped into it and ran a campaign, and that was the video that we saw at the beginning of this session. They learn by doing, and I really commend them on taking the risk and putting themselves out there.
And I would add that they've created a financial consumer protection unit within the central bank, and are now looking at how to build the staff and build the capacity and what activities that unit will undertake. Jacqueline?
Just one more point on the financial service provider side, because I think banks and MFIs tend to see financial education as a cost center. And what we've been really trying to do with our partners is shift it to look at it as a business driver. And so how do you build it into your marketing, into your operations, and really measure it the same way you would a marketing campaign. So measure, is there uptake, is there usage after you have a certain intervention, and build it into those regular touch points you're already having with your clients, so it no longer becomes its own cost entity, but is really built into that overarching business case.
So I just want to add small thing, especially all the financial providers, microfinance. I think that we should have the unit that main focus on the financial literacy program in the financial institution, that we can just only provide the financial literacy to the customers, not just only the one microfinance. So we want all the microfinance together. So we just only we put everything together, so it will be more effective as well. Like Sen mentioned one more thing as well. So we are very happy when the Cambodian government just only want to add the financial literacy program in the education program from the youth, from the high school, from the university. I think this is very good, important thing, that just only to build the mindset of the youth people to have the financial literacy knowledge.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about financial literacy, and I'd like to talk a bit more about consumer protection, because these often go hand in hand. In terms of regulation and supervision, what examples can you provide of economies where financial service providers are given the space to innovate and scale, but at the same time that clients are adequately protected? And financial literacy can be a part of that, but especially with new products and services coming into the market. Do any of you have any thoughts on that?
I can start in the region that I'm based in. I'm based out of Australia. The Pacific Islands, we've seen through AFI, there's a Pacific Islands Regional Initiative that's been operating for several years now, that's really been working hard on its financial inclusion strategies, but also its consumer protection and consumer awareness strategies. And the first thing they did was try to reduce the regulatory barriers to entry for new financial products. And I think they've made about 21 policy changes and within central bank regulation and other government policies to open up the playing space for financial inclusion. So they've seen as a result of that the entrant of a number of telcos and other digital service providers. And the Pacific is not a lucrative market. It's very low populations. They're geographically dispersed. It's a difficult area to work. And so it's not an area that telcos and other companies immediately run to. And so they've actually done a fantastic job in creating a conducive environment for companies to come and innovate. So on the flip side of that, they've also done very well in terms of consumer protection. And the way that they've done that, it's been multifaceted. As we've just talked about, Fiji has received accolades for its work in consumer education, and particularly within the school sector, the formal education sector. They've done some really exciting stuff. The governments have been very willing to share information between countries in the region. So they've had 4 peer reviews where they've assessed each other's financial inclusion and consumer protection practices, provided feedback, and they work together. They've also got a deliberate approach to work together with a range of stakeholders. So they actually invite NGOs, consumer advocate groups, donors, private sector to sit around the table in policy formulation. It's a really great example where we're seeing consumers protected, but we're also seeing a really exciting phase of new product development.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to this, back to financial literacy and talking about whose responsibility is it for financial literacy, and also bringing in the fact that a lot of countries now have national strategies for financial inclusion, and some countries have or are developing national strategies for financial literacy. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some of the key actions that you think ought to be in a national strategy for financial literacy, particularly thinking about long-term, thinking about scale, and also going back to the very first question of at the beginning, what works? Because we don't want to be putting together things just for the fact that it's put together. It needs to have meaning, and that it leads to impact and changes in people's behavior and improvement in people's welfare.
Most experiments that we've seen, they are just that, they're experiments in the financial capability space. And there are a number of things that limit the ability of these things to scale. One is it costs a lot of money, and there isn't that kind of money available. The second is that, most of these tend to be housed within the not-for-profit. So it's all well when it happens at a financial service provider's level. The minute you start thinking about scale, or at the level of a country, it tends to come down to a checkbox. And so, while I think financial education strategies need to create an atmosphere for innovation, but not be so prescriptive that it ends up being a checkbox. Who can play a role there, however, are donors, because there's a huge reputation risk attached to the fact that you're providing incorrect information, or you're not, or you provide, or for financial service providers who provided services that are dormant and that are not being used by consumers. And so there is a strong business case. Unfortunately, it's hard to prove that business case in the short term. It takes a long time, and then there are a number of factors that interfere, making it hard to establish a clear correlation.
Just to build on that, I think one thing that comes to mind when you think about national financial inclusion frameworks and financial literacy frameworks is that link with the education of the youth. And I think this came out in the video Good Return put together, where you really see that savings behavior, for example, in good financial management is taught early, and the earlier the better. And so I think as we think about building it into kind of national approaches to education, we've had some experience where the government had not yet included that, and private sector players had stepped in to partner with schools to deliver financial education programs to youth. But as Jayshree mentioned, we don't have those long-term studies to see what that case is. So we're starting to invest in research where we can look at youth that participate in financial education programs, have access to accounts very early on, versus those youth in comparable schools who do not have that access or that education. Stay tuned, it's not yet there. How we track them over the long term and think about that transition to adult savers and adult financial participants is a bit trickier, but I think it's a really interesting space to explore and something that governments can keep an eye on as they think about building it into their national strategies.
There is one other thing that's happening in both Mexico and India, which is they're linking their direct benefit transfers, or G2P payments, to accounts to make sure that utilization goes up. And I think that's an interesting way to make sure that uptake exists. We still to see the effect of it, but as nations or as nationwide policies, I think that's a potential solution.
So I'd like to, at this point, I'd like everyone to just take a moment and think for a minute or two about what had the biggest influence in your personal financial decision making. If you consider yourself financially literate, or perhaps not, but if you do, what factors had the biggest impact in how you manage your finances today? Just take a minute to think about that. So I'm going to ask the panelists first. What had the biggest impact? I think it's useful for us to think about this. I mean, we are looking at different target audiences, perhaps, but I think that there's some fundamentals that are important that we consider, especially as we look at whose responsibility is this and what strategies can have an impact. Shane?
I would say for me, one, and the studies corroborate this, growing up in a household where you're exposed to good financial management practices is a really big influence over your future behaviours. But if I look at my single biggest financial commitment at the moment is the loan I have for my house, and the decision that I took to take one loan versus another, I had access to advice and comparison services. So we're really lucky these days in terms of technology, the number of comparison sites that are around there, and also I went beyond that to seek professional advice on what works. I think for me those couple of factors have been really important.
Similar, I think this goes to having an environment that shows proper financial management. But at 6 years old, I opened my first savings account, and so I learned to have my passbook, which we no longer have in the U.S. But really showing how much you had as a balance, how to manage your expenses, I think from a very early age helped. But again, I think when we think of the more significant investments as we grow, for me, student loans were a huge area where, again, decision-making around providers at certain junctures, when I was 18 and took out my first student loan, I didn't know to ask the right questions. And I think as you grow and as you get more exposed to different financial products, you can learn to ask the right questions, the rates, make comparisons, make more informed decisions.
Yeah, for me, I think it's in terms of if the customer is not well understand on that, the first one, it can be impacts to the over-indebtedness. So that can be the big or negative impact to the families. And so, the standard of living of the people, of the family will be going down. And one more thing as well, sometimes the customer cannot use the appropriate products and to borrow the loan from the microfinance, and later on the customer difficult to manage the cash flow, and later on the customer can be delinquency, something like that. So that is the big problem as well to scale up the business activity. That is the big impacts.
So So people become literate quickly when they're in a crisis or make efforts to.
Well, I come from a family where people live really long lives, and fortunately for them, they worked with the government, so they had pension. But then it occurred to me very early that thanks to my choice of profession, if I were to live 30 years past retirement, I'm in deep trouble if I don't plan. So it was that moment of epiphany that really brought home the need to plan for my old age.
So I think one interesting comment was, yes, family influence and seeing how family members conducted their finances, but also the products and services that were available. That was part of the education process of knowing what products were available, what choices to make. That's part of the education process, and I think that can be applied at the grassroots level as well. We have quite a bit of time, but I think this is a really exciting topic, and there are a lot of exciting examples. I'm actually going to put someone particularly on the spot, Mr. Abivikrema, formerly of Hatton National Bank, and I would like, or you're still with the Hatton National Bank, and I'd like to hear the example of the youth savings activities that Hatton was engaged in, and there was a lot of research that showed the impact that had.
Thank you, Kelly. One correction. After 25 years, I retired from Hatton National Bank last year. Now I'm at another bank, another state bank, third largest bank currently. With regard to what we did at Hatton National Bank, which is one of the largest private sector banks, we went to the really grassroots level in bringing the financial education as a simultaneous program of creating accessibility to the youth. One of the things what we did was, in Sri Lanka, we went to the schools with the support of the Central Bank and the Ministry of Education, and we embarked on a program. We are creating school banks within the schools, and that was the beginning of creating the financial education program at a very young age to the students, and that also really created a further ripples, because it gave opportunity the parents of the students also to understand how this mechanism works in the context of the savings and on the other financial products. So the bank created a separate brand for the financial inclusion, plus also separate mechanism for financial education program under a different brand. And wherever they open branches in rural areas, one of the critical thing is to partner with the schools and the temples and the churches to bring this as a kind of a religious kind of enabler to bring that education aspect, So I think in Sri Lanka we have nearly, because of the free education, we have nearly 95% the literacy rate, but the financial literacy is around very much less, around 30%. So we embarked on almost 25 years ago on a special vehicle by the bank, setting up. Now, currently there are about 300 school banks, particularly the bank which I retired from has, and one of the key deliverables is delivering financial education through the schools, through the teachers, and to the parent community, and that works perfectly well. And I think currently close to 1 million children are having savings account, and particularly through this particular bank. And I think it's an ongoing program. There's investment in it. The bank is committed to spend money on that. Very often people ask particularly me, is it viable to invest in such a program? I said, of course, if you're going for a 1-year balance sheet, it is not viable. But if you're going for a 5-year balance sheet, definitely it is going to make sense. And I think that's exactly what has happened as a result of this program. There's enormous build-up of a savings base for this bank.
I would also add that the youth are engaged in managing the savings banks, and also you've ended up employing a number of those young people.
Yeah. Each school bank is managed by the youth. There are 5 youth managed, and then there is a teacher in charge of the school bank unit. And most of the students who manage school bank get a certificate after 1 year completion. I think already 50,000 students have got certificates saying that they have managed school banks. And I think a number of them have been absorbed to the bank, and some of them are now current managers of the normal branches of the bank as well.
Thank you, Chandulu. I think it's super exciting. Do you know of any other countries or any other banks that have taken this on?
Yeah, I think because I have showcased this globally, I think some of the countries in Africa, Ghana, and many of them are adopting this. And particularly we went and replicated in Mongolia. I think the Horse Bank has adopted that through Women's World Bank. I think in number of countries adopting our model very successfully.
Thank you.
We are very early inspired by HNB's approach. I actually still have my pink elephant piggy bank on my desk that the children receive to learn savings behavior, and we've worked with a few of our partners to actually take lessons that HNB
So the
has.
pink elephant, we have a pink elephant kind of a piggy bank. We have almost about 5 million pink elephants in the hands of children.
And some adults.
And some adults. Wonderful. Yes, Wal? No, that's okay. The translation needs to hear you.
Under the policy guidance of the central bank, almost all the private banks and the government banks have introduced the school banking. Right now, around 1 million students are accessing to these facilities, So it's wonderful. And the number of the students are increasing every year. So we really appreciate the policy guidance from the central bank. I have just one question to the panelists. Can you tell us a little bit about how the financial literacy impact the better portfolio management in terms of microcredit, given the repayment rate in almost in all countries more than 99%? Thank you.
Book, do you have any, no? It's
I can add one point on that.
Yes.
Most of our work around financial literacy has been around savings and insurance, but what we have seen in those institutions that are thinking of it from a purely credit perspective is in terms of, if not directly on portfolio quality, on building loyalty. And especially in more competitive markets, I think we should think of financial education as a quality of service. And if that can build your loyalty with your client base, that they're coming back to you for their credit, I think that's a huge business proposition.
I would add it's extremely difficult here in Cambodia to impact portfolio quality when par levels are so low to begin with. But in our work in other countries, including the Philippines and Nepal, we have seen impacts on par levels immediately following financial literacy training. What we haven't been able to study, though, is whether they're sustained over time, and it would be interesting to take a look at that. And also, I mean, they haven't been subject to randomised controls, so not quite that degree of scrutiny, but we have seen reduced par levels following specific targeted credit management courses that are focusing on areas of high delinquency.
Yeah, so I want to add one thing that, especially in the top 10 microfinance in Cambodia, currently we use the financial literacy program and the customer protection principle, and to some kind of one tool related to the credit risk management as well. So if all the microfinance actually implemented properly related to the financial literacy and the consumer protection well, so I think this is the one part that we can reduce the portfolio risk as well.
You can use nudges and reminders to make sure that people repay on time, particularly when you're targeting the SME segment. And I think in the group loan, it's not so much a challenge, but the SMEs, you can use reminder SMSs.
Thank you. Other questions, other examples from other countries? Yes?
Hi, Leanne here from First Finance. Just from looking at not just portfolio sort of quality, but looking at how you increase your portfolio by using financial education and actually view a customer in a different way. As a practitioner, have you seen any situations where practitioners have given education and then determined, because the person has passed a certain thing, that they are then eligible to get a different type of credit facility or something like that? For starters, has anybody seen that? And also, is it the best thing that practitioners are actually doing the advisory services when you see so much of the advisory services being about their own products, not about how to make decisions? And secondly, it really isn't in their interests, it isn't in the customer's interest to seek information at a time that they don't need it. So I don't learn something if I don't absolutely have to. When I have to, I'll commit to learning about it. But so how do you find that point where it should be done? Okay.
I think that's a good question, and that goes to whose responsibility is it, and what is the vested interest? Is everyone acting in the best interest of the client by providing financial education? And that's where I think a number of different players have a role to play. But Jayshree, you have something?
So, I mean, the direct answer to that is the KGFS model in India, where basically they set up branches in locations where there is at most one other bank branch or possibly none. And what they do is start off by enrolling a customer and getting all kinds of data about the household. And then they talk the customer through. So most customers first come for credit because, that's the easiest. But during the conversation, which they call a wealth management conversation, they set financial goals. And so it's not just about providing credit, it's also about understanding what are the larger financial goals that you need to achieve, and what are the best set of products that will either protect your well-being or enhance your well-being. So, for instance, somebody might come for a loan, but if that person is the primary income earner, then you also need to protect the family from shocks if something happens to the primary income earner. So therefore, is it possible to suggest insurance? Now you're right that, in terms of incentives, they can only provide what they have. But part of the exercise would also enable the household to realize, or the person who's at the other side of the desk to realize that they can potentially go to other providers. Because KGFS operates in a region where it's hard to find other providers, most people end up coming to the branch. But if we were to extrapolate this to another geography, potentially there is scope to shop around or compare.
On the issue of objective advice and institutions providing advice to their own clients, so we have a consumer awareness and financial empowerment program here in Cambodia in partnership with CMA and working with Credit and SAMIC and Satapana in the past, and we've also worked with LOLC. We've conducted experiments on using independent financial educators versus staff of MFIs as financial educators, and I think theoretically our preference would be that people were independent, that they can provide independent advice, but what we find practically is that the ability to engage with clients, so the practical results we got from our training, I think that's probably what we should cut to, is that we saw much better adoption of behaviours and practices amongst those where it was delivered through the financial institution, because they could talk directly about a specific product, people could ask questions about it, they could interact with the financial service provider rather than talking theoretically about a range of products out there in the landscape. And so there are other factors as well. When working through financial service providers, generally we had better, more highly educated staff than we did when we went through community trainers. So that was, a clouding factor, I would say. But in theory, we would love them to be independent. In practice, for delivery models, just the engagement with the financial service provider means so much in this space.
Sorry, just to add to that, do you think that that's because that person is actually seeking financial information at that time? So when I'm talking to a credit consultant, I'm actually thinking about how am I going to get money out of that person. Whereas if I'm talking to a community leader that has no money, I'm like, yeah, whatever.
Quite possibly, in terms of how you see them and what they can offer, that may well be a factor.
But it's also needs-based. You're more open because there's something that you want. So I think the question is it credible and truthful, the information that's being provided, and not being manipulative? Because we're assuming that financial service providers, that they are mission-based or that they are looking out for the client's best interest, but there's also a financial incentive. I would add there's one country, and I can't remember, unfortunately I can't remember which country, but if I remember correctly, the regulator required all the financial service providers to demonstrate what they were doing in terms of financial education. That along with the products that they were getting a license to provide, they also had to provide some kind of financial education. I can't remember which country, so if anyone...
Fiji mandated
Fiji?
that.
Okay.
And if I could just add one point, I think there's also a trust factor. And again, the onus is on the financial institution to make sure that they're training their staff well and living up to that social mission. But I think we've seen that clients tend to trust their bank officers, and that relationship is actually quite hard to break. And so in terms of absorbing information and being willing to be open, that's a huge factor, and I would imagine one of the reasons that you saw those results, Shane. But just on your second question about the receptivity to information, we've seen some really interesting success outside the financial institution, but working with factories and factory workers with peer training. We partnered with Business for Social Responsibility. BSR has a HER finance program to do financial education in factories, and they use peer trainers. And what we found is that the women factory workers really valued being able to interact with those people over a few months. So they didn't have to ask questions in a specific session, but could come back a month later, 2 months later, and ask questions of those same peers since they were working right next to them. And so thinking about innovative models where you can build those touch points where people can reach out at the point that they need that information, I think is also critical.
Thank you. Other questions, other observations? Yes, Maria?
Hi, my name is Maria Perdomo, and I work for the United Nations Capital Development Fund. I manage YouStart, a program that has brought access to financial services in tandem with financial education to youth in sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the things that we tested in YouStart, this is a comment and then a question, were different models for financial service providers to actually deliver financial services in tandem with financial education. One of the models that we saw worked best in the program was exactly a peer-to-peer learning model used by our partner in Rwanda, Umutanguha. And what they were doing were basically forming groups of young people, then training the leader of that group, and then using that young leader to cascade the education to other groups of young people. That was powerful in the sense that in two ways. In one way, because youth listened to youth, right? So the impact was greater. And then in the other way, and that's where my question comes, because it was more sustainable, right? And that's in particular very important when is the financial service provider the one that is delivering the education, right? Because there must be a business case to deliver that education, right? And we know that that's costly. And it might not be in the best interest of the financial service provider to see, because in the short run, the benefits of that education from the profitability perspective might not be immediate. So from your perspective, what models have you tested or have you seen there that could be more sustainable in the long run? Provided by the financial service provider.
Yeah, so thank you for this for the question as well. So So far that, like Shane mentioned about we have the partnership in terms of the financial literacy between LOC and the Good Return Australia as well. So we have two methodology. The first one is just some kind of the provide the TOT to the village trainers. And the second one just direct provide the trainings from the staff from the microfinance. So later on we just select the staff from the microfinance from the LOC to conduct the direct training to the customer is much more better, because sometimes in Cambodian, I just say something about Cambodian context, that very difficult to select the village trainer that can re-echo training to the people in the village. So sometimes that the village cannot well understand, cannot catch up properly, and they cannot well understand about the products, about the anything related to the program, so they can lose some things. So that is the reason why that in my practice, so we select and we provide the sufficient trainings to the staff, and later on the staff they conduct direct training to the people that just select the people who interested that in the program, and later on we just conduct it. Thank you.
An experiment that we're working on at the moment is with the current consumer awareness and financial empowerment program partners, is looking at their business plans, both their annual business plans and their longer term business plans, and trying to determine which ones we think that we can impact through our financial capability efforts, and then involving not only head office staff but also branch office staff in collecting data on programs and relating them back to their business metrics that they're reporting on a monthly or quarterly basis. And that's still in, I guess, in progress. Look forward to reporting back on that. But ultimately what we want to do is to be able to prove that there is a long-term business case in providing financial capability support.
I think it's a great point, and we've had some success with training of trainer models. I think the challenge is finding those ready-made groups. So I think if you have youth groups, we found some success in schools, we found some success in factories, but I think having that peer model can be tricky if you're first creating those groups, because then the cost savings doesn't really come through. But we have had an interesting experience of training of trainers for the financial institution to train other players in the sector. And so one example that comes to mind is some work we did in the Dominican Republic. It was also a telenovela, a social soap opera. And it was a mass media campaign that was done. The bank that led the work did their own trainings, but what they also did was a trainer of trainers for 18 other NGOs in the market, because the idea was that this was going to have such broad impact. How could we leverage that impact and really see more people getting that follow-on training and really seeing what the lessons coming out of that social soap opera were? So I think you have to find unique ways to find the right groups of people to pass on that model, but I think it is a way to achieve that scale.
Thank you. Other questions, other points? I'm curious from the investor perspective, what are your thoughts on whose responsibility is for financial education? I would imagine impact investors would want the financial institutions that you're investing in to be lending responsibly, and part of responsible lending is doing proper assessment that the clients are financially literate, financially capable. I'm curious if any of the impact investors might have a comment. Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Okay. It's fine, yeah. So from investors' perspective, because we do target and we do pay a lot of attention to the institution being socially responsible, right? We do assessment of institutions work in that field. Then again, the way it is done might be decided by the institution, whether they do it on their own or they partner with someone else, like, and the extent of that work also. I mean, it's very different from experience. Even looking at the Indian MFIs, for instance, we see that they try to do to integrate some financial literacy component, but it is very limited given the model they use, right? Then in some other countries it's maybe more advanced, like in Cambodia. But for us it's very important. We do assess, but we understand that it can be the same across different countries, right? The contribution of MFIs into financial literacy.
So it's really on an individual basis. It's not comparable.
Yeah. And we present that to investors. We just, then they would decide whether they want to support the institution which has that component, or whether they don't want to support the institution without the component, etc. Thank you.
Just on the topic of consumer protection, all banking sector players obviously have a responsibility for consumer protection, but the microfinance sector has a unique responsibility because it's targeting people who are often new to formal financial services, and consumer protection is about doing no harm. So in a financially literate context in the banking sector, doing no harm is for a bank a little bit easier than it is for a microfinance institution. For a microfinance institution to ensure that they're doing no harm, they need to make sure that clients actually know what they're getting into, that they're aware of terms and conditions, that they're able to manage debts, that they're able to manage other products appropriately. And so even if you don't have a strong social mission, your basic do no harm requirements mandate you to get involved in financial capability building if you're working with new entrants to the financial sector or communities with low financial capability.
Related to that, Shane, I'm curious, I saw a rating agency here, and then they just slipped out, but I see another former rating agency person in the back. But I'm curious, from the rating agency perspectives, how do you evaluate microfinance providers in this, from this perspective of do no harm, but also how embedded in their product design are financial education, financial capability mechanisms, particularly those who conduct social ratings? So I don't know, are there any raters left here? He's gone out. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay, Elisabetta.
Elisabetta from Microfinance Rating. As a rating agency, we do assess client protection and how the institution mainstream client protection in their policies and procedures. And we do this, for example, by conducting client protection smart certification, pre-certification, and and this not only in client protection certification we do this kind of assessment, but the assessment is also embedded in our microfinance institutional rating methodology and social performance rating methodology. Why? What does client protection have to do with microfinance and financial performance rating? We, as a rating agency, decided to include this in the analysis because, of course, it relates to other risks at the institutional level. First of all, reputation risks. So we thought it was really relevant, especially after the crisis that happened in the market, to include this in the traditional financial performance assessment. And then because it's clearly related to the other risk, first of all, credit risk. When we talk about over-indebtedness, of course, we also relate this to credit risk in terms of focusing our attention on how the institution screen its potential clients in terms of assessment of the repayment capacity, in terms of understanding of their clients, of their products they're going to take, to make sure that they understand which are the responsibilities also in terms of repayment. So this is a kind of analysis that we always do.
Thank you, Elisabetta.
Credit is always, it's a pull-based thing. Clients will come to you for credit, and one of the ways in which microfinance institutions, at least in India, have been dealing with it, is to say that, oh, if you default on a particular product, your record shows up in the credit bureau, and therefore you won't get a subsequent loan. So it's fear, it's not education. What's important when you think beyond credit is, and a lot of MFIs are now moving beyond credit into even offering savings, even in India. And it's important for them to shift and make sure that, while their field officers go out, they're able to offer, they're able to explain the savings features product without spending too much time. And I think there was some interesting work which was done by Microsave at an MFI called Cashpour, and 17 Triggers is here. So I think we should ask them to speak about that experience, because effectively the business problem that the MFI was facing was that the agents could not, or they didn't know how to train the agents to offer savings products. They were predominantly credit-led. So how do you transition from offering credit plus savings in a way that makes sense to the client and to the agent? And I think there was some interesting HCD work which happened there.
We have someone from Microsave here?
No, or 17 Triggers. I think Roswell's there.
Thanks so much, Jayshree. So for the Cashpour project, it was a big challenge. We were looking at very busy credit officers who were being asked to start acting as savings officers when they started accepting deposits. And we had very strong savings education curricula coming out of India, but of course those were very long to deliver. I mean, you're looking at sessions that were an hour or so, and as some of you saw in the field trips earlier this week, it's very difficult for very busy credit officers to work a lot of that kind of commitment into their schedule. So the challenge that we were looking at, in partnership with Microsave, was how to deliver a savings curriculum with a sort of 1 hour model, but in 10 to 15 minutes of these credit officers' time. Using HCD approaches and using a lot of tricks from advertising, we came up with a persona, sort of a imagined spokesperson, the financial warrior, and how to draw up, and then just looking at different activities that could quickly engage people in that, from gallery walks, where the credit officer can just set up posters and sort of an immersive experience for the women clients, to other things like that. And it was highly effective. I mean, as Jayshree knows, we increased savings by about 80% during the pilot, and account openings by about 40%, I think. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Other comments from the audience? So I'm going to go back to a question that I had asked a little bit earlier, but again, as moderator and coming from a development finance organization, what is a useful, impactful role that a donor organization can play in helping to move financial literacy forward, and keeping in mind that we're looking at evidence, we're also looking at scale and impact. So I put it to the panel, and then I put it to anyone in the audience.
We don't have a repository. I mean, when we were doing the CFI study, we found we had to look, far and wide, and it was very, very hard to find evidence. A lot of financial service providers that we spoke to said that they have problems. They definitely have challenges in usage. They have challenges in delivery, but they just didn't know how to solve it. So that's problem number one, which is to build some kind of a repository. Two, there's no money very often at financial service provider level to experiment. And you need to experiment in order to figure out what's the best strategy for you to deliver services. We need to create that pool of free money. It doesn't exist right now. And I think there needs to be some kind of a networking platform almost, where people can post, these are my requirements or these are my challenges, and have somebody respond to that, saying, hey, we've tried this in this part of the world and this works. And we don't have that either. So those are the three things that DFIs can do.
Very useful. Thank you. Jacqueline?
And if I could just build on that, I think, in terms of building that evidence base, really talking about cost-effective approaches for financial service providers. I think, we've seen a lot of experiments about, very intensive financial education programs, but some of these more innovative, lighter touch methods that would make business sense for financial service providers, I think, need to be tested to see how effective they are and to see what the cost drivers really are. And so I think, having that kind of resources to support that work and that experimentation, and then showing that business case to other financial service providers could spur an investment. And the second area I would think of on a more mass media scale, we've alluded to some of these social communications initiatives. They sound fun because they are fun, and we find people learn better when they're enjoying how they're learning. And so I think, that's a big investment up front, but the dividends we've seen over the longer term are quite good. And a lot of times these communications are, like nothing people of this income segment have ever seen. They don't usually see people who look like them and dress like them and speak like them on television talking about the same problems they face in their own lives. And so using that as a platform to inform a general public about financial awareness, I think is really a critical intervention, and I think that funding needs to come from a larger source.
Well, just to echo Jacqueline's point, in terms of the campaign that the NBC ran here in Cambodia, it was targeted at youth, and it was trying to get youth to talk about money, have conversations. That was really the purpose of the campaign, hence Let's Talk Money. And as Jacqueline said, the video that we watched at the beginning used drama, but the other 5 PSAs that were developed used comedy, and people responded really well to it. We had over 30,000 Facebook likes of this. So it was delivered primarily via Facebook for urban youth, and for rural youth it was delivered via TV and radio. And we had 15,000 Facebook shares, and so that was one proxy for people having a conversation. Youth having a conversation is sharing information with their friends on Facebook. Just the novelty, the fun, the ways of engagement, but those campaigns can be expensive. And for someone like a regulator who's never done it before, they often need an incentive, and that's where donors can come in and support those types of activities. If I could just add too, the video at the beginning that you saw about the young boy, that was actually a true story. So we conducted focus groups through schools, and we ran a competition with schools here in Cambodia where they submitted their own money stories. And a young boy, 12-year-old boy from Prey Veng province, submitted the winning entry, which was ultimately made into the video that you saw at the beginning. And so that was another way in which the central bank engaged with the formal education sector and brought a range of stakeholders together, as well as NGOs and other service providers out there, to tackle it jointly. But this does require funding, and quite often to get things started, that's where DFIs really play a useful role.
And who funded this particular campaign?
It was a combination of, we sourced funding from a private funder in Australia, as well as USAID provided funding. We also had partners here, such as Smart Telecom, and a range of other partners who all contributed in different ways. And so it was I guess, a collaborative effort from a number of different agencies.
Thank you. Are there any last questions before I'm going to go ahead and summarize? We think it's all right if we conclude a bit early, if there aren't any other questions. Unless we wanted to watch the humorous piece. Sean, is it easy to put up one last video? Okay, all right. Okay, so I think what my kind of key takeaways from this session are that, well, it's obvious, but there's lots of different approaches to financial education, financial literacy. I think that some of the most successful examples that have been brought forward are ones that are embedded in the product design. I think that's a key. Teachable moments, that it's when people are having access to the financial services, when they're probably most receptive to learning about them. The role of social media, of visual videos, I think also. I think that that financial education is a long-term proposition. It's not a one-time effort. And a lot of the ones that we heard that seemed the most successful did target youth, particularly in the case of in Sri Lanka and others. There are dangers in not doing anything, in not providing any kind of financial education, financial literacy, and I think it's dangerous to a financial institution, but also to the economy and to the welfare of people. There's a cost, but the cost can bear fruit over time, and that goes to the long-term initiative. I think from the donor's perspective, helping to build that repository of evidence of what works, and finding vehicles and platforms for sharing that information. I think that's a really valuable takeaway. I think that raising awareness and looking at not one intervention may make the difference, but lots of different interventions. So I think that everybody has a role to play, and I urge you all to think about what role you can play in this, and with the ultimate goal of we want to raise people's welfare and the welfare of their children. So thank you very much. I would like to thank again my panelists for their contributions and the questions, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon for the conference. Thank you.